Thank you all for coming. It's a small crowd tonight here, but I appreciate you all coming here. This is going to be the last Liberty and Economics lecture for the year. This is the seventh time I've hosted a Liberty and Economics lecture here, and tonight I'll be doing the presentation. You all know me. My name is Don Wilson. I'm a family lawyer. I practice in New Westminster. I'm also the leader of the BC Libertarian Party. Tonight I'm going to be making a presentation about libertarianism, specifically an argument for closed border libertarianism. I set about wanting to research this project because all I had ever heard about the subject from libertarians were open border arguments from libertarians. And a way I proceed to learn about a subject, I like to see the flip side of an argument and pursue it and understand it fully to help to give me a better perspective on a philosophy or a subject. So that's really why I'm presenting this argument or this presentation tonight. Also, a couple months ago, we had a presentation in here from Paul Geddes. He's an economics instructor, and he gave a presentation on open borders and why we should have fewer controls on immigration. And he sort of made the libertarian and economic argument for that. And Mr. Geddes actually lent me the book that I'll be covering, that I took the arguments from today. And I made this as a bit of a repost to him, or to bring some counter arguments to him. So the book I'm summarizing from tonight is a book by an author named Chase Rachels. Has a rather controversial title that you might have seen in the promotional materials. White, Right, and Libertarian is the name of the book. So I'm not going to be, nothing in my presentation tonight has anything to do with whiteness as far as I can tell, as far as I know. Perhaps it has something to do with right-wing politics in ways I'm not, I could see that argument, and it's certainly a libertarian argument. So that's the main focus of what I'm summarizing tonight is again a libertarian, or in this particular case, an anarcho-capitalist case for closed borders. So just to summarize Chase Rachels' immigration argument, he's, in his view, the pure libertarian solution is to privatize everything and allow private property holders to determine who enters the property, including jointly held property. In other words, this is anarcho-capitalism for those who are familiar with it. But in Rachel's view, this isn't happening anytime soon. So he argues that until everything is privatized, the next best solution is to manage public property as if it is owned by net taxpayers in proportion to their net tax payments. And so he argues that property owners do not treat their property as borderless. Rather, individuals, they need an invitation to enter. Rachels argues that this should be the policy for public property. And finally, the other piece of Rachel's argument is that inviters ought to take out insurance and be liable for the conduct of their guests in case that their guests do harm. So for Rachel's, perhaps the problem is not so much who will build the roads, which libertarians already know the answer to, but who will build the gates? Who's going to be keeping people out of public property? As I said, Chase Rachel's book is about, it talks about a few other things that I'm not going to present about. I did read the whole book, but they just weren't as relevant or interesting to me. So, as you can take from the title, Chase Rachels writes about white people. He writes about which he defines as people of European descent. He has a chapter on why white people are relevant to the development of libertarianism, and how they're important to that, and argues that their culture is under attack. I won't be presenting any of his arguments on that subject. He also makes a case in his book that libertarians ought to ally with the alt-right. So that's another subject I'm not going to go into, particularly, well, mostly just because I was interested in his immigration arguments, and that's what I wanted to present on. I thought that was the most interesting part of the book. And I also thought he did a fair job of describing anarcho-capitalism. So I thought it would be good to present his case for it. So anarchism entails a society without a state, though not necessarily without a government. The state is that institution which asserts a monopoly over the creation, interpretation, and enforcement of law. The state is the ultimate arbiter in cases of interpersonal conflict. And the state is that which reserves the unique legal privilege to pay taxes. So this is just kind of an overview of anarcho-capitalism. Got a picture of Judge Dredd there as a representation of the law. So one thing I noticed in reading Rachel's book is he's a disciple of Hoppe. There's lots of quotes and references to Hans Hoppe throughout the book. And here's the first one to kind of get you started about anarcho-capitalism. Two near universally accepted propositions exist. Every monopoly is bad from the viewpoint of consumers. On the other hand, the production of law and order is the primary function of the state. In Hoppe's view, both propositions are incompatible with each other. So just this idea that we all seem to know that monopolies are bad, and yet we believe that the state can only operate by having a monopoly on law and order. That's the anarcho-capitalist criticism. The capitalism in anarcho-capitalism, all scarce goods are subject to private ownership, including land and other means of production. Two or more people may be partial or joint private owners of a scarce good. Private ownership means to have an exclusive right to utilize, occupy or employ it, whereas there exist non-owners who have no such right. And a right is that which one may justifiably employ force to defend or seek retribution for its violation. So these are some basic terms, but to give you a sense of what the capitalism in anarcho-capitalism refers to. So capitalism and anarcho-capitalism seeks to solve the problem of social order, which is scarcity. So it deals with those goods that have the capacity for mutually exclusive usage and whose demand exceeds their availability. So you have the two dogs here fighting over a bone. And when goods exceed, when they have the capacity for mutually exclusive usage and their demand exceeds their availability, those goods are said to be scarce. Rachel's defines property norms as the legal basis for adjudicating interpersonal disputes. Or in other words, to determine when the use of force is justified and who the victim and aggressor are in any given conflict. And to do that, one must discover who owns what. So who owns what in the anarcho-capitalist formulation? Hello, Louis.
Hi.
How are you?
Pretty good.
Thanks for coming. Have a grab a seat.
Sorry, I'm late. Got back from San Diego.
So, how is ownership defined in anarcho-capitalism? Basically, property rights are gained through original appropriation, through homesteading or voluntary exchange. Original appropriation and homesteading states that the first user and claimant of a previously unowned good is that good's rightful user. So basically the first person to get to something and make use of it. That original appropriation includes physical possession, transformation, embordiment. These are all examples of homesteading acts. So, you have to get to the property and do something with it, mix your labor with the good or the property. And Rachels argues, the anarcho-capitalist argument is that since this method awards ownership to the very first user, it is therefore devoid of conflict, as is the other way of acquiring ownership through voluntary exchange. It's also conflict-free. So in this way, anarcho-capitalism is a conflict-free system. Another essential element of anarcho-capitalism is self-ownership and the non-aggression principle. The non-aggression principle condemns all acts of aggression. Aggression, Rachels defines as the uninvited initiation of physical interference with the person or property of others, or threats thereof. The principle of self-ownership stipulates that one is and can only be the sole owner of his own physical body. So an important point with respect to that is you don't have to establish property rights over your own body, because the objective connection to your own body is just so obvious that you don't really need to establish it or demonstrate it to anybody else. It's just self-evident that you control your own body. In the anarcho-capitalist formulation, according to Rachels, the state is self-contradictory. You have a picture of Two-Face here, or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Essentially, he's arguing the state cannot even protect private property without contradiction, because in order to do that, it needs to first tax the population that it's going to protect. So before it can protect, it needs to, levy taxes and take resources through force. And for that reason, and because taxes violate the non-aggression principle, the state should not act to protect property rights without first violating them. Anarcho-capitalism, in Rachel's formulation, is tolerant. Only in a free state can you have cats riding unicorns that are breathing fire with a pistol. This is the anarcho-capitalist utopia here. As Rachel sees it, anyone can live in any way they see fit, as long as they refrain from committing aggression, as previously defined. If they would like to voluntarily pool their property with others to form mutualist enclaves, conservative covenants, or socialist communes, then such is their prerogative. The greatest variety of lifestyles are permitted under an overarching anarcho-capitalist legal system, according to Rachels. Which brings me to the libertarian case against open borders. See a private property sign in here, and that's sort of the premise of Rachel's immigration argument. Paul, you weren't here when I summarized his argument. I'm getting into it now, but essentially, Chase wants to treat public property as the jointly held, privately owned property of net taxpayers. Rachel's recognizes that his solution is not the best solution, as I said before. He thinks that the status quo that we live in an unfree state where we have to deal with the state permanently, that there's nothing likely to be done about that anytime soon. So the question he tries to answer is what immigration policy most closely aligns with libertarian ideas, principles of justice, given this permanent status paradigm that we find ourselves in. As he says, no such policies will attain the purity of justice that would result from the absolute privatization of all public goods or services, coupled with the elimination of the state. Rachels draws his theory, as I said before, from Hans-Hermann, who he credits, as well as Stephen Kinsella, who's pictured here. He also credits Walter Block with really criticizing Hoppe's formulation, and Rachels claims that he has incorporated Block's criticisms into his articulation. So Rachel starts by leveling a critique against open state borders. According to Rachels, it's the open state borders that are a one-size-fits-all solution that are imposed or would be imposed on all domestic tax-paying citizens. I've highlighted this point here because I really think this is the most important point of Rachel's argument, is that in his view, domestic taxpayers or property owners are the legitimate joint private owners of all developed or improved upon public property. So if you accept that premise, then I think Rachel's argument follows that any person who is attending on that property without invitation from those individuals is guilty of trespass. So in his view, existing anti-discrimination laws would force association between the invaders, as he refers to them, and domestic citizens, which he argues would increase social tension. And he tries to flip the argument on its head and saying that open borders would necessitate state violence, because if you, again, accept his argument that net taxpayers are the rightful joint owners of public property, then according to that, they should have the right to evict uninvited people from that property. But of course, the state would, that's illegal. So the state would need the power to intervene and prevent people from rightfully evicting people from their property. And I took this from CIS.org. So this is just a citation that Rachels makes to this source to support his claim that immigrants use the welfare system and create a bigger demand on the state than native-born populations. So Rachels identifies a fundamental disagreement between libertarians, and I tend to agree with this as well as I've tried to think about the problem. You have on one hand libertarians who see public property as unowned, or who want to treat it as unowned, versus those who see public property as belonging to net taxpayers, essentially. And this creates quite a tension between, philosophical tension, whether there ought to be, no rules. If public land is unowned, then, nobody has any authority to make rules with respect to it. And theoretically, it might be open to be homesteaded or, homesteaded. Versus the other side, which has its problems as well. Like, I think there are complications with both of these formulations. I think the unowned philosophy is missing something. I mean, just that you're pointing to, by the fact that anybody could just seize it. But that's clearly not quite right. Like, the roads aren't available to be homesteaded. I mean, it doesn't seem quite right. And certainly, foreign governments aren't available to just seize those roads. On the other hand, the argument that public lands ought to be treated as private property of domestic net taxpayers, I think the criticism I would make of that is it's kind of made up. I mean, it's a construction, or it's an idea. very little legal reality to it. That the government ought to govern public property as if consistent with how net taxpayers would vote for it to be used.
Oh, you mean like a true extension of the will of the people?
Well, not all the people, the net taxpayers. Yeah. So he seems to be arguing that the government ought to imagine that all the net taxpayers have shares of the public property in proportion to the amount of taxes that they paid, and that the government ought to govern consistent or in such a manner as if these people had voted on what to do with public property. So that's what he's suggesting ought to be done. With the government, how government ought to govern at this stage until everything's privatized some distant day in the future. But Paul, you make a good criticism, and we were making criticisms of that formulation as well. There's this, in this dichotomy, or these two different ways that libertarians can look at public property. Which is, one is they're unowned, and the other is that there's this construct that they're private, this diffuse, constructed form of ownership. There are criticisms of both methods. To me, neither seem quite right, I guess is what I'd say. There's criticisms, I think, of both. You levy those criticisms against the second one, but likewise, I think it's not quite right to say that the public property ought to be treated as unowned as well, because that doesn't really reflect. It doesn't really reflect taxpayers as victims. Like the state, it doesn't reflect that the people who have been, whose income has been appropriated, probably have a greater claim to restitution from those public lands than unrelated people. So I think there is some argument in there that changes the characterization of this public land from unowned into something different. But I'm not sure we've quite got the answer to that yet. But I'll set out Rachel's argument as to why the second formulation is the better one. So he says, he asks the question, what determines one's property rights to a particular good, or in this case, say, a piece of property? Rachel's answers that it's his or her superior, objectively verifiable link to that good or that property. For external goods, meaning not yourself or not your own body, this link must be established via original appropriation, homesteading, or first use. So we covered that before. He argues that the state has homesteaded much of the land that it claims, all this developed public property, the roads, hospitals, parks, and schools, but it only did so by taking taxes. Thus, according to Rachel's, that improved upon public land belongs to those net taxpayers who funded its development. Those taxpayers are the people who can demonstrate the best or superior objective link between themselves and the land. So Hoppe backs up Rachel's here. This is Hans Hoppe's argument again. There exists a fundamental difference between unowned goods and public property. The latter is de facto owned by the taxpaying members of the domestic public. They have financed this property, hence they, in accordance with the amount of taxes paid by individual members, must be regarded as its legitimate owners. So this is, I guess you could say, this is a Hoppian argument or a Hoppian approach to public property in the libertarian formulation. Rachel's tries to support his argument by a bit of a thought experiment about what would Anarcho-capitalism do, what would be done in Anarcho-capitalism. he argues there would be no free immigration or open borders. That people would require invitations before traveling through or on property. He notes that some residential or commercial areas would be more open than others, and some would be more closed than others. All property owners would maintain the right to evict anybody visiting, or not visiting, but on their property if they weren't invited. And that Rachel says that the best way to get to this, to end Capistan, to the private property utopia, is that all public property should be divided among individuals in accordance with how much taxes they paid on net. So their contributions minus the subsidies they have received. So here's the next best solution. As I said before, the best solution for Rachel's is this anarcho-capitalist society, which in his view is a long way off if it's ever going to come. So he proposes corrective and preventative measures. So his corrective measures, the proposal he's suggesting is first, privatize as many public goods as possible. Pursue a genuinely free trade policy. Aim for political decentralization. Immigration and other policies determined at the most local level of state. And ban foreigners from voting or having access to tax-funded welfare programs of any kind. The preventative measures that Rachel suggests, as I said before, a foreigner's entry onto public property be contingent on having an invitation from a property owning citizen. And we touched on this before. He was arguing, or repeating Hopp's argument, that only property owners can invite people because of this special. They're the only people who have a place to reside without requesting permission from anybody else, and that gives them a sort of, as I said, an inalienable and semi-permanent status. As I said before, Rachel proposes that the inviter be held liable to the full extent of his property for any crimes that the invitee commits. He says, practically speaking, Papa says, practically speaking, this would mean inviters would have to take out liability insurance for all of their guests. We touched on this before. I don't know if that, Papa probably doesn't mean that, doesn't envision a state entity being required to mandate that. It's not clear to me how that liability amount gets determined otherwise, but again, I might lack the understanding of a polycentric legal system to articulate that sufficiently. He suggests that a public record of such invitations might be kept so that that you could theoretically at any time determine whether somebody had been invited into an area or not. Foreigners should be exempt from paying all local taxes. He argues that even if they do pay taxes, they do not become entitled to an ownership interest in public property. Rather, they can only become citizens by purchasing real estate. Please don't ask me why. I don't know. This is an argument that Hoppe made that Rachel's refers to, that citizenship can only be obtained by purchasing real estate. Rachel's doesn't advance the reasons for that position in the book very well, so I can't speak to them well. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me, though I doubt, again, it was something that Hoppe just said frivolously. So, that in a nutshell is Rachel's proposal. He responds at the end of that chapter to some common objections. We touched on some of them already. The first one is that this is too technically complicated to be realistic, and that refers to the fact that he's using this net taxpayers term, and that's a term I was using more often than he does. He does define it a bit with a bit more technical detail in the book, but you could imagine trying to determine how much any person has paid net in taxes versus what they have received back in value from the state or from the government would be very, very challenging, to say the least, and perhaps too challenging to even be possible. Might be a criticism. Rachel's response to that is perhaps, but that doesn't make the principles behind the argument any less sound. The second objection Rachel's addresses was the one that Paul brought up, Mr. Geddes brought up. A property owner could just invite unlimited people, thus effecting open borders. He says no, they would have to get insurance, and people could never afford that much insurance. And we touched.
Wouldn't they also have to remain on the person's property that invited them? Like Paul Geddes, if he invited 7 billion, they'd all be on his property.
Well, no, because what Rachel's is saying.
If they're on somebody else's property, they'd be trespassing.
No, so what Rachel's is trying to provide a solution to what to do with public property as it exists right now. So he was talking about Anarcho-capitalism to just try to draw inspiration or say that
How you said there was no public property in campus?
there's no public property in Anarcho-capitalism. But Rachel's trying to make an immigration policy for the current system, for the status
So
quo.
this is applying to the current
Yeah, so applied to today. So what Rachel's is saying is, in order for non-property owners, non-real estate property owners to step foot on public property, they need an invitation from a property owner. And that property owner also needs to take out liability insurance for each guest. Another one is that aren't there other people entitled to the public property or to the state's property? And other people might be, let's say, victims of the state, victims of war of aggression, or perhaps, that's the most obvious one I can think of. To which Rachel's replies, yes, but in his view, that's an empirical question. Again, that gets answered by determining who gets how many shares of public property. And he says that's not the question he's really trying to look at or trying to answer, but he recognizes it as a empirical or technical problem. Another objection he addresses is, wouldn't it just be better, Chase, if the state returned all the stolen money and didn't have to worry about this, and then treated the land as unowned? And to which Rachel's replies, the state does not have enough money to pay everybody back, so we're taking the land. I'm summarizing Rachel's point there. Another objection, common objection he identifies, I think, is another one that Paul, you were getting at. I don't like the fact that other joint owners might override my preferences regarding the access restrictions to public property. He says, too bad. It's jointly held property, and that's the nature of jointly held property. You don't get to decide by yourself everything that happens there. It's determined by a majority of shareholders. And then another objection he faces, I suppose, is he's not talking about national borders, and that's sort of a subtle implication of his proposal. He's just talking about developed public property, so that property that has roads or the hospitals, the parks, those things where the state has, I suppose, given the appearance of homesteading, the state has mixed, the taxpayer's labor with the land. That's the property that Rachel's is articulating this principle about, that should be controlled by net taxpayers. So he would, I think, by saying that, he's implicitly in agreement with Walter Block's point that if there is virgin land in the nation, that should still be open to homesteading and first use principles. And he says, yes, that's right. I'm just talking about the developed public property, not national borders. Another objection he faces is that the shares in public property that he's theorizing about aren't really like, they're not like real private property. You can't sell them. And all he really says to that is, yeah, that's a fair criticism. That's what he says in the book. It's an imperfect solution. So then another objection he identifies is something we've been talking about, is this idea that that this would require a central committee to determine who can enter the property and who can't enter public property. So I don't feel like I was able to, I certainly wasn't able to answer that question fully, and I don't feel like I understand how that would be done. And he says no. That you're, Mr. Geddes, you're and Lewis and Lloyd, you're stuck in the statrix, and you're just thinking about monopolistic law enforcement. It would work similar to the way that polycentric law would theoretically work. That's his response to that. As I said, I had a few criticisms of Rachel's as I read his book. One was that I found him sort of needlessly inflammatory throughout. The controversial book title is one piece of this. It's just, as I wrote up there, I mean, it did well to get him some attention. Namely the referencing whiteness in the title of the book, I think did get him some national attention. It was part of the reason I was curious to read what he was writing about, I suppose. But by making the book also about racial identity, in my mind, he clouds his argument. He clouds whether he's trying to make a book about racial identity or make a libertarian argument about public property. As I said earlier, he has chapters on whiteness, European nationality, and the alt-right. In my view, all of these things, again, cloud the effectiveness of that argument to an extent, or at least confuse the issue whether his real goal is to make a white state, perhaps, talking about whiteness and the alt-right, or if rather it's really to identify what to do with public property as a libertarian. As I said, is he trying to win followers to this kind of idea, or is he actually trying to just change minds and make persuasive arguments? So another point was, in the book, he refers to these uninvited people as foreign invaders. And I suppose technically that's could be true. It seems needlessly inflammatory in my mind. He's identifying these people both as foreigners and invaders, whereas if we're just talking about private property and not national borders, it seems rather nationalistic to be talking about foreigners and invaders. So something just didn't quite sit well with that, with me on that. I don't know if anybody can read this, but I touched on this a little bit as well. I thought I had trouble understanding the distinction, or the importance of the distinction between net taxpayers and real property owners. We talked about this a little bit as well. Like, I don't actually at all understand why, let's say, net taxpayers wouldn't have a right to invite people, or a right, to control public. It seems as if net taxpayers might have a right to, at least theoretically, be treated as if they control public property, and yet don't have citizenship under this formulation. I just found that very confusing, and I didn't understand really the need for the distinction. He says that property owners and only real estate property owners may be inviters because they can offer a place to reside without permission. But this is a bit of an artificial distinction, and Paul, I think you started thinking about it as well. you can have a contractual right that is maybe short of ownership or different than ownership, that could be permanent or very long-standing, and likewise, or on the flip side, real estate ownership can be subject to a variety of covenants that control who you have on your property. Just as if you own an apartment in a strata building or a gated community, you own that property subject to the rules of that strata or of the gated community. And it very well might be the case that community or that strata has rules about the guests that you can bring into that property. Despite the fact that you are a real property owner, you're not necessarily any better off contractually or in terms of legal right. You're not necessarily better off or in a stronger position to have guests there unfettered. So to me, it seems like Rachel's and Hoppe's conception of private property owner is overly expansive, and their idea of a renter is overly narrow. Because what I think is more relevant is what is the nature of a person's contractual relationship, or I should say, what should be more relevant is if you're going to talk about who has a right to reside somewhere, what you want to know is what is their, what authority do they have? Is it permanent? Is it or is it subject to conditions? Not so much whether they're real property owners or just renters. And the reliance on real property ownership could be easily gamed, it seems like, to me as well. If you could just sell 1 foot of land, now you're a real property owner, and you can, now you can invite people, or now you're a citizen, according to Hoppe, and now you can invite people. Something doesn't quite seem right about that, let's say. So that's one criticism. Another criticism I have is this proposal about governing things as if the net taxpayers were voting on it. It sounds an awful lot like just a better way to govern, perhaps, or like it just sounds like better statism rather than more libertarian. Or as I said, it sounds an awful lot like Hobbesian good governance. Well, this is a bit. I'd also say that the book got a bit confused towards the end, because he spends most of the essay talking about this invite-only proposal that I understand him to be articulating, and then at a strange point in the essay, towards the end of it, he then sort of turns around and says, well, actually, the invite-only policy is also unlikely to ever be implemented. And I just, thought I understood what he was about, and then he says that, but then he carries on again as if the invite-only policy is what he's referring to. So I just, I tried to read it very carefully, read it several times through. It does seem, he talks about the invite-only policy, and then it says it's unlikely, but then he continues talking about it as if that's the policy he's proposing. I think it was a contradictory essay, I suppose, is what I would say. And then the Geddes point. Paul's made this. Mr. Geddes, or Paul Geddes here, and I have discussed this issue a few times, and Paul's raised this point before, which is how are births different than the foreign invaders that Rachel's is referring to? If other people aren't allowed to come onto public property, then are the children of people who already live here allowed to?
On somebody else's land. So that's why you don't have the right to invite wherever you want. If they can come in by helicopter.
It sounds like everybody's starting to get into their own discussion, so I'm gonna end my presentation here. Thank you so much. Appreciate you staying with me. Please do follow me on YouTube. I've started a channel there. YouTube.com, Mr. DNS Wilson. It's an old URL. I'm sorry, I created that like 10 years ago. And I'm on Facebook as uselessgov or uselessgov, depending on how cynical I am. If you're interested in Chase Rachels, the author, you can find him YouTube and elsewhere as Radical Capitalist. And of course, I'm the leader of the BC Libertarian Party. We're on Facebook. We have a website as well, bc.libertarian. Facebook.com, bc.libertarian.party, or libertarian.bc.ca. Please do check us all out. Enjoy the music, enjoy the discussion.